Chapter 11. The first thing Hugh heard when he and Lavinia opened the door to the room upstairs was Madeline Peabody's merry voice. "You are too late!" She was sitting upon the bed, her shining Sunday dress only lightly touched with rain. She must have come here in a good carriage arranged by her lover. She couldn't have been a greater contrast with Lavinia, whose riding habit was clinging to her body, heavy with water, and whose hair was soaked despite the hood. Hugh knew which woman he would have rather been looking upon. It was not difficult to find the small town in the vicinity of Cheltenham. He used to ride all over these lands in his carefree adolescence, and the names of them were as familiar and sweet on his tongue as crispy green apples. Had he been alone, he would have reached Prestbury hours before and already scoured the inns. But he was not alone, and Miss Dudley was not used to riding. There was nothing in her earlier life to prepare her even for stately riding along Rotten Row, let alone a madcap dash through the night rain. He had to keep to her side, his fingers light upon the reins. The image of Lavinia losing her balance and slipping out of her saddle right upon the hard ground was simply refusing to leave the inner chambers of his mind. But she had kept her balance well, kept her posture even, kept her lips closed, kept herself from any complaint. Kurt von Walmoden was sitting at the modest desk in the corner of the room. By the looks of it, he was writing a letter. "We aren't," he said briefly. "Van Walmoden, we need to talk. I hope you aren't asking me to send my delightful bride out of the room." The nobleman stood up. "After all, in that case, we would need to put your own lady friend outside the door, and I don't think you would do that. I know about your plan." "Do you, indeed? It wasn't a very complicated one," Hugh said venomously. "Such indignation from a resident saint, isn't it? A man who has never had a weakness for the female sex." "I did." He used to, before Lavinia Dudley filled his thoughts. And that one was no weakness, but a disease that invaded one's very bones. But fortunately, they also had a weakness for me. I never had the need to deceive them with sham marriages to get them into bed. He knew he was being crude, and he felt Lavinia stiffen beside him. The sensation gave him a reckless, perverse determination. Let her remember what he was and recoil. Perhaps then, the shocked tenderness that he saw in her eyes when he took her face into his hands would wither and tease him with no false hopes any more. "The marriage is very much real," Madeline Peabody piped up. Kurt von Walmoden nodded, laying a hand upon her shoulder. "It is real," he said simply, "and my royal relative is going to have to recognize it. He isn't, and he won't." The older man nodded at the papers he left upon the desk. "Do you know what these are?" he asked. "Letters describing His Majesty's current condition in exquisite detail. The papers are going to be rather interested to find out the truth about his latest antics. It would rather shatter the image he and you and the other equerries and countless servants worked so hard to create, won't it? It would certainly make it rather difficult to pretend that the Emperor has any clothes on afterwards. Von Walmoden, we are at war. The people need to be a united front. They need something to believe in. That was the whole purpose of coming to Cheltenham. Not so much inspecting the new local militia, definitely not enjoying the healing waters. It was to show the subjects a parade of glittering symbols, like those effigies of saints they carry around in Catholic countries on feast days." "I know that, Grenville. So would His Majesty and the Prime Minister and every last man or woman on the palace staff. The need to keep King George's true condition secret would overwhelm any resistance, precisely because, as you say, the people need something to believe in. I know a better way. Take Miss Peabody. Address her correctly as Gräfin von Walmoden. Take your radiant bride with you to your father's court in Germany. There you would have a better chance of keeping your marriage only a minor scandal and not the sort that would involve the royal family. His Majesty might overlook it if you are to keep as far from Windsor Castle as possible. Now why on earth would I do that? Because there might be some shred of honour in you. You are a man of fine blood. Prove it." "Since when do you care about anyone's honour but that of your own dead father, Grenville? Ah, Kurt von Walmoden smiled a twisted smile, his gaze shifting to Lavinia, who was standing there wet to the last thread. "I think I see. Now you have a living reason to pretend that integrity and caution, don't you?" "I have not the slightest idea what you are talking about." "I think you do. I think you are a hypocrite of the first water, Grenville, haranguing me for marrying a genteel young lady, while you yourself are throwing yourself at the feet of a tutor's get. I wonder what it is that you saw in her. She is as cold as a stone statue. When she finally falls into your bed, your extremities are going to freeze off." A white-hot, blind rage flooded Hugh's mind. In one swift action, an arrow in righteous flight, he took off his glove and tossed it at Kurt von Walmoden's feet. "I have an offer for you," Hugh said, his anger glacial in his voice. There was no usual desire to persuade in him, no honeyed charm left. The only words in his throat were those of action. "I am challenging you to a duel, von Walmoden. You have insulted a lady who deserved none of it, and dragged her into a sordid scheme she lost much more tears over than either you or Miss Peabody have. If you are to lose and survive, you are going to take your wife into exile to the continent, and you are going to never let Miss Dudley's name cross your lips on either side of the channel." Fine words for a man with all the confidence and skills of a pup. "What if it is you who is going to be beaten, Granville? Then you are going to be free to throw all caution to the wind and take your bride to the royal court when it returns to Windsor." Kurt van Walmoden was a tall, dark presence, towering too high for this puny room, or he tried to be so. "And what is going to happen should I put a bullet through your head, Granville?" "In that case, you would have to leave the country anyway. So, in a way, I would have won." "How noble of you. Dying for a lady's honour. I would have almost believed you had I not heard of your exploits for years. There is not a harlot in the towns of Cotswolds you hadn't sampled, not a married lady at court you hadn't enjoyed. You didn't give a pig's foot about their honour. So why this one?" "Because she is a lady of great virtues. I am not talking about the fretting of never being completely alone with a gentleman without matronly witnesses. I mean real virtues. I also mean passions that no rote learning could drain out of her completely, and that is a rare treasure in our age of walking paper dolls and papier-mâché cavaliers. I mean a talent that is never neglected, and strength in the face of mistreatment grown men would have long since exploded under." Hugh felt Lavinia's keen, anxious eyes upon him. Hugh and his opponent knew it was not Madeline, who was sitting through the crude and angry talk with the face of a patient saint, suffering for a future bliss, they were talking about. Hugh wondered if Lavinia, too, knew. He also wondered if she would care, after von Walmoden's revelations, about his confirmation of what Lavinia had long suspected from the rumours. His prim and proper Lavinia, the mirror and the light of womanhood. Suddenly it felt easy to walk into the rain on a cold spring dawn and point a gun at another man's chest, or even to have one pointed at his own person. He smiled. Sharp nails dug into his arm, and Lavinia whispered, her voice ferocious, "Don't you dare!" It was the passion for words that betrayed her. The clinging obsession with words, as though those sounds or signs on a paper were to her what gin was to the unfortunates of St. Giles. If not for that passion, that obsession, she would not have been struck so completely dumb with Hugh's speech, forgetting for a second the doomed decision he was taking at the moment. He said she, for only a complete ninny-hammer would not have been able to understand his misdirection, his evasive lack of names, was a lady of great virtues, and passion, and talent, and strength. The revelation was so blinding, it had taken her a second to come to her senses and grasp his arm as though she were a jealous wife. Lavinia didn't loosen her grasp even when Hugh stiffened. "This is not your quarrel," Hugh said sharply. In the candlelit murk of the room, his face was paler than usual, and so lined with shadows as though he had already lived the remaining decades of his life. "You are starting it in my name, therefore it is my quarrel." If Lord Granville was to withdraw the challenge so suddenly, without the other side having apologized for the insult, Kurt von Walmoden explained, he is to behave like a coward. Surely you are not going to demand that a man clearly dear to you behaves like a coward, Miss Dudley.
This is ridiculous.
This is the way of men of noble blood. I understand if your father has never imparted it to you. After all, there was to be no application of such knowledge in the life he thought you would lead.
Then apologize,
Lavinia demanded. She was done with pretty pleading. Apologize and take Madeline to the continent. You seem to think Madeline as a kind of doll to be hauled around at will. I suppose desire for a better life is far from the mind of a woman as virtuous as you, but my wife wants to take her place at my relative's court as much as I want her to do so.
Madeline,
Lavinia addressed the redhead, who was sitting sensibly motionless.
This is madness. You cannot wish for this. Do you understand that a duel can well end in death?
Madeline Peabody, now apparently Magdalena von Walmoden, turned her pretty head towards her, and Lavinia saw such utter disdain in her eyes that it would have withered her on the spot had it been true venom.
You simpering creature, she said. You goody two-shoes. I wonder if there is a living fibre in your body, or if it is all porcelain in your flesh and water in your veins. Oh, yes, Miss Dudley, I understand how a duel can end in death, except it won't be my husband's. He is excellent with a rapier.
Duels are usually fought with pistols.
In our country, perhaps. Not in the German states. Kurt was the one challenged, so he has the right to choose the weapon. I hope Lord Granville paid some attention with his fencing tutor. This way he might survive for 10 minutes instead of 5. Madeline, you cannot want this. I very much know what I want. Do you think it was easy to live with my brooding hen of an aunt? Pretend to be a creature straight out of conduct handbooks for young ladies? I seethed every single moment. Sometimes during those long sermons, I felt like if I cut my palm, the blood that would flow out of it would be pure flame and burn the whole edifice down.
Lavinia had heard enough. In the back of her mind, she filed the pretty speech away for a future use in some distant novel, but here and now, she still had had enough. She grasped the sitting woman by the arm, pulled her from the bed, and marched her out of the room none too gently. She screeched and fought. She was not the only one whose blood finally caught fire. Lavinia slammed the door. She was now alone in the corridor with one very irate redhead.
"No arguments left, I see,"
the latter asked archly, her cheeks flaming.
"You are now resorting to manhandling."
"Listen to me, you ninny hammer! I see you are imagining yourself Lady Macbeth, but in reality you are an utter fool. You've heard it right that King George is rarely lucid now. Who do you suppose it will fall to make decisions about arrangements at court?
His eldest son, of course. There are talks of him becoming regent any day now, and he has an appreciation for brave men and lovely women to decorate his court. Cheltenham is not the backwater you think us to be. We hear things."
"Clearly not very well, because the Regency bill isn't likely to be signed any time soon. There was a talk of it some years ago, but the notion is dead and buried now." It felt as though a true living fire was erupting from her every pore. All the burning she had stifled for the last few years, and in some ways since her proper Fordyce-reading childhood. The person who guides the life of the court is Queen Charlotte. Unlike her husband, she is thinking very clearly indeed.
Her Majesty is a woman with most women's soft heart. I know how to elicit sympathy from women.
It was as if the hands of an invisible sculptor had touched the pale wax of Madeline's face. A second ago, it was a mask of contempt. Now, it took on the tenderest vision of humility one could possibly imagine. If Madeline Peabody was not quite so respectably born, and was not setting her sights quite so high, perhaps she should have taken to the stage. She would have made Sarah Siddons anxious and thrown Mr. Sheridan into raptures. Her Majesty, a soft heart! I would have never thought to hear these words in one sentence. Do you think her daughters call their abode a nunnery for the quality of singing?
Princesses of all kinds have always been sheltered.
Have queens always? Lavinia paused. An idea had dawned. a memory, a warm spring evening, a chilling tale, snatches of golden laughter from the rooms at her back.
Have queens always ended their days in captivity too? What on earth are you talking about?
Have you never heard the tragedy of Queen Caroline Mathilde? No. I imagine it is not the tale your husband would tell you. It might have put you off accepting his generous offer after all.
Quit speaking in riddles, Miss Dudley.
If you want. She was King George's own sister, married to the monarch of Denmark. She scandalised her brother by taking a lover. Lavinia left out the Queen's obvious, glaring misbehaviour of capturing the kingdom's power for herself and the lover in question. If she didn't, Madeline might have reasonably pointed out treason was a far greater offence than any elopement, any secret marriage. Lavinia didn't want that. Words had power, and their absence did too.
What do I care?
Let me finish, please. When the favourite was cast down, Queen Caroline Mathilde was initially supposed to have been sent back to England into an honourable exile. She never reached these shores. Her Majesty was against it. She would suffer no wanton, scandalous women at her court. Her husband was the king, but her word was law. Queen Caroline Mathilde was a sister to one king, and a wife to another, and a mother to one future monarch too. But that didn't save her. Her Majesty wanted her punished, so punished she was. She died before reaching 30 years of age in a dismal fortress in Germany. She was, by all accounts, beautiful. Lavinia had never been a cruel creature, but she couldn't help but add, just like you.
How do I know you are even telling the truth?
Madeline asked, but the ferocious resolve in her voice had waned.
You can ask your husband.
Cut! Madeline pushed the door open, running back into the room like a red-headed hurricane, all pretence of composure gone.
Did it truly happen as Miss Dudley tells?
Did what happen?
The king's sister. Did she truly end her life in exile thanks to Queen Charlotte's disapproval of her ways?
Oh, that old story! Kurt von Walmoden waved his hand dismissively. I suppose you could say that, but that's never going to happen to you, if this is what you fear. Queen Caroline Mathilde had a royal honour to uphold and failed, while you have not a drop of royal blood in your veins.
Yes, that's the problem, Madeline replied angrily. If a queen could die in captivity because she was not virtuous enough for Her Majesty's ways, what hopes do I have? I could just disappear.
Her Majesty isn't bloodthirsty, Hugh remarked, his face as bland as though he were playing 21 with his friends. At worst, she would simply arrange for you to be married off somewhere nice and distant, as soon as this unfortunate union is proclaimed invalid. Madeline grew pale. Not in the decorous cream-white way tragic heroines on history paintings did, but with the pallor of desperation and bone.
I don't want this,
she uttered, her tone an admirable, but not quite successful attempt at steadiness.
A guillotine, but not this.
You have a talent for melodrama, Hugh observed. There was a hint of cruelty in his voice. Could it have been thanks to the words she hurled at Lavinia? No one is going to cut your head off. You were going to live and grow old as a respectable, plain-bonneted wife somewhere in the far reaches of Northumberland. Your husband, whoever he will be, is going to expect some gratitude for accepting the leavings of a scandal, but I expect you know that already. You are, after all, so very worldly, so very knowledgeable, if your speech in Miss Dudley's direction is to be believed.
I will not grow old as the respectable wife of...
A strange choice, given the alternative. All Hugh's charm, all his sleek magnificence, had now turned into a sharpened steel. Would you prefer to die young, then? You are talking to my wife, Grenville, Kurt von Walmoden growled, not to one of the Cyprians you are no doubt more accustomed to. Me, accustomed to Cyprians? Never. It might be a strange notion to you, but I prefer women who are eager and willing for my own person. Letting one's wealth do the seduction is the path of a coward.
Kurt, Madeline whispered urgency, looking up at her husband. Don't let this man rattle you.
He insulted my wife. He all but compared you to a lady of the frail sisterhood.
Let him compare me to the breakfast kippers if he so wishes. I want to live and to be with you.
Of course. He is your only hope of advancement, after all, Hugh said, stating the obvious.
Please,
Madeline pleaded, as though not hearing him.
Perhaps we really should go to the continent. Your father, your brothers, they're not going to annul our marriage, are they? There were stranger unions, you've told me.
Of course they won't. They would lack the legal mechanisms to do that. Lavinia felt entirely calm, as if standing in the centre of a great storm. Of course, they might petition His Majesty to do so on their behalf, but there is smaller chance of that than of Queen Charlotte doing so. Lavinia thought of Queen Charlotte, the resplendent figure in the royal chapel, murmuring disapproval at the appearance of Dr. Johnson's friend married to a foreigner, the pale woman in bed, keeping her composure and supporting her husband's delusion, as though she were putting on one of those royal masks the courts of the last century were so famed for. The iron-willed mother, determined to keep her daughters about her, even if it meant depriving them of love and marriage and motherhood themselves. The keeper of traditions, who possibly was the sole person within the palace walls, not counting, of course, her royal husband, who took the sermons of her childhood exactly at their word, and spent decades trying to wrestle her world into conforming to those moral tenets. If her sister-in-law led a life bloodier and more lascivious than those tenets allowed, so much the worse for the sister-in-law, queen or no. And if a no-name young woman from a small town did the same, or nearly, in Her Majesty's mind, the same, so much the worse for the young woman. "You were keener than me to be introduced at the court at Windsor," Kurt von Volmoden told his bride. "You were burning to be acknowledged as my wife."
I am burning still. But what use would it be to be introduced as your wife one moment, only to be repudiated the next and ruined in the bargain?
"You won't be ruined."
"You could have told me," she whispered, her lips set not in petulance, but in a kind of harshness that suggested she would not forget this diet of false hopes. "You could have told me of the Royal Marriages Act."
"King George isn't going to invoke it. Not with the sword I am holding over his reputation's neck."
"Would his wife not invoke it either?" Madeline asked pointedly. "She might decide our marriage is a greater shame than a little scandal in the papers."
"She won't." Kurt von Volmoden's voice was full of the utter conviction of someone who strode through life with an iron certainty of all one's efforts being successful and all one's enemies falling away unopposed.
"But she might." Madeline looked up into his eyes. "She might, Kurt. What is going to happen to us then? What is going to happen to me?"
"Swear, upon whatever you hold sacred, that if I take you to the continent, you are not going to spend your years pining for the glories you've almost had and blaming me for losing them. Swear it, Madeline, and we will leave for Dover tomorrow morning."
Madeline stood in the middle of the room, distraught and lovely in the candlelight. Lavinia held her breath. She had long since stopped feeling pain from the fingernails she was pressing into her palms. Her skin had become numb to physical sensations. Some of it was the cold. Most of it was the mute terror, the mute bravery, and the storm surrounding her calm. Hugh was looking on, alert and brave, his eyes clear as the green glass of some old vessel. His sweet mask, his pretty languor, he had lost them somewhere on this journey to the God-forsaken inn, and they were not in any hurry to gather themselves from the shards. "I swear," Madeline, now Magdalena von Volmoden, claimed, pressing a hand to the spot on her chest where her heart was most likely beating, "upon my reputation as a good woman."
Chapter 12. "So, what are we to do now?" Hugh asked when the door closed behind them, after what felt like eternity. They were left standing in the corridor among the sleepy rooms.
"Talk to the innkeeper about 2 rooms on the opposite ends of the corridor," she said, "and make sure we can count on his good testimony that we indeed took separate ones."
"I doubt that people whose judgment you most fear would bother themselves with the good testimony of an innkeeper. They would hear that we disappeared together, that we were seen together at an inn, and that some noted that we went up together. That would be enough even for the milder of gossips, and I am not sure mild gossips exist at this court."
At this court.
The glittering fever dream of Windsor Castle, the ball at St. James, and the morning ceremony of dressing Her Majesty had fallen so far into the back of Lavinia's mind over the course of this mad dash of a night that forcing them all back into recall felt almost unnatural. With recollection came not so much fear, but a kind of dull registration of a fact. Yes, she was likely to be exiled from court when the events of tonight came to light, especially since they would have to conceal their primary reason for the journey. If it were to be known they found a royal relative in the midst of conducting an unsuitable union and didn't drag him back by hook or by crook, being merely released from her duties would become to Lavinia a blessing. She was likely to end up a shunned spinster once the news of the reason for her exile back to her family home crossed their little circle. All those plans, all those little schemes, find a husband, then entrap a maiden, then prevent a misalliance, and that was what they all came to. I suppose you are right. Lavinia felt numb and spent and dejected, but above it all she felt tired. I have a plan to prevent that. Hugh Granville stepped toward her. Another plan? She smiled with only the corners of her mouth. Your plans so far have led me to a certain ruin. I wonder if the next one is going to end up with me being dead. I don't think so, unless we are to kill each other in marital quarrel. She stared at him, dumbfounded. Surely Viscount Granville couldn't have possibly meant in a marital quarrel, Hugh repeated, looking intently upon her, as if trying to drink in the very outlines of her mouth, of which I suspect we are to have many, if you accept my proposal. Her head became very light, as if Madeline was right and her blood had truly turned to water. You cannot truly intend this. I can. Moreover, which is more important, I do. You are the heir to an ancient title. Not that ancient. It has only been turned into a proper title by Henry VI, and my family received it even later from the Stuarts. This is not what I meant. God almighty, but you are impossible! See, we are going to have marvellous marital quarrels, Lavinia. May I call you this? May I call you Lavinia? Even if you reject my proposal, do leave me at least this prize. Please. He was pleading with her. Viscount Granville, her rakish saviour, the man in whom passion and duty tangled together in such an impossible knot, was pleading with her. And it occurred to Lavinia that perhaps some knots were truly best sliced with swords sharp as vengeance. I know the abyss between us, he continued. I am not the fool some think me to be, but it seems to me that this abyss is yawning much wider in your head than it does here in the world of things. It's those people, the first keeper of the robes, the ladies-in-waiting who wait for nothing but an opportunity to sink their claws into someone's flesh, Her Majesty with her prudery and her nunnery. They made you feel like you were mud on their slippers. You aren't. What you truly are, well, I've already told that to Kurt von Walmorden, and trust you have a good memory. I would honestly never repeat anything said in his presence. The less I call the man to mind, the better. Lavinia opened her hands to him, palms upwards, not so much offering a touch as yearning for it. Then she remembered something. She opened her reticule and withdrew a letter of several pages folded in two. I wrote it when I was in a strange and dark mood, she said, offering it to him. He was putting his heart on a platter for her. The least she could do was respond in kind, let him know that, in a moment of despair, she was ready to allow herself to be debauched. The names are inked out, Hugh noted, his green gaze running over the first few paragraphs. I wanted to be sure no one would connect it to us if anyone found it in my room. Why did you keep it, then? Because I thought to use it in some future novel, Lavinia explained, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. God, Hugh said, looking at her. You are quite unlike anyone else in the world, aren't you? Lavinia swallowed. She wanted to bottle this gaze up like wine, to store forever before it faded, once he realised what she was offering him. It did fade. It was not replaced with a frown or anything else as obvious, but she noticed the whiteness that crept into Hugh's knuckles as he held the miserable pages. You were thinking to become my mistress? He asked, raising his head. Lavinia's first instinct was to lower her eyes, to keep her silence, but there would have been no sense in that, and no use.
I thought it to be a better course, an honest course. I thought it was conniving in the ruin of another woman, and guarding my own virtue as a precious treasure at the same time seemed hypocrisy of the first water.
Your opinion of me must have been worse than I suspected if you thought I would agree to become your sacrificial altar.
You did kiss me on the balcony. I thought you found some allure in me.
I did. God help me, I do.
Even now, after I've shown you this?
After you've shown me you are a creature of labyrinthine logic and motives of some medieval saint, I can see how these could be detractions. But I'll do my best to untangle the former and teach you better than the latter. Him? Teach her? The presumptuousness of it. Lavinia imagined just what he could teach her behind the closed door of a bedchamber when they would be undisturbed, as a married couple should be. She imagined all the instruction his tireless capacity for mischief could provide her. She blushed at the mental image, feeling her skin becoming strangely taut, just as it did that night on the balcony. That is, Hugh continued, if you will agree to become my wife, my Viscountess Granville.
I would, Lavinia replied, her voice unsteady even to her own ears. I would, only...
He clasped her around her waist, letting the unsent letter flutter to the ground, and drew her into a hungry kiss. The sensual power of it scattered her thoughts. Pressed close to his lithe, lightly muscular body, she felt the heat of his skin through the layers of clothing, burning as hotly as though she were pressed against him without a shirt between the two. The notion fired her imagination up, and she thought of how it could truly be to be pressed against the man she loved, with nothing to shield their skin from each other's. Oh, yes, the man she loved. She could now utter the dangerous word in her thoughts, for she was now going to be his wife. His. Lavinia's heart was beating hotly by the time the tight circle of his arms relaxed a little, allowing her to draw back. Only? Hugh asked almost innocently, as though there had been no interruption to the conversation. Lavinia smiled.
Only, she said, we are still to get separate rooms here.
My little minx, you are going to tease me to distraction, aren't you? He asked fondly.
Have I ever teased you?
Oh, yes.
I would have thought my dress and conduct were very modest.
Not always. For example, ever since that evening at the theatre, I couldn't stop thinking about your dear ankles.
When I wore that green gown,
I would have lied, Hugh said, his hand still upon her waist, and his thumb stroking it warmly, just as she had once imagined him to do, if I said I remembered the colour of the gown. Hugh Granville knew they did not have much time. Kurt von Volmoden's disappearance would be known soon enough, and then the royal couple, or rather its female half, was going to be too preoccupied to listen to any petitions. Therefore, when he rode back into Cheltenham on the coming morning, his bride by his side, he made straight for Fauconberg Lodge. He couldn't quite stop throwing glances at her, as though there was a chance of her falling from her horse or some other disaster coming to her. Rationally, he knew the notion was preposterous. On his less rational side, he felt apt to take on the whole world, in order to shield her from more pain than Lavinia had already encountered on her path. If the pain in question could come from something as mundane as the hardness of spring ground, so be it, and he would take it up with nature.
Are you nervous?
Lavinia whispered, as they dismounted by Fauconberg Lodge. It sounded sweetly similar, it occurred to Hugh, to what a newly wedded bride might say to her groom in anticipation of the wedding night. The notion made him regret the endless days and nights of empty beds that were going to stretch like a desert between the present moment and the moment he could finally claim her as his wife in every way. But now was not the time to think of the delight they could enjoy together. Now was the time to screw his courage to the sticking place. Of what? Hugh asked, rather disingenuously. No man, least of all the Viscount of Granville, would have liked to let his intended see he was indeed uneasy about confronting one of the most powerful women in the world. A woman who sent a queen to exile and cold death. Lavinia seemed to have felt something unnamed beneath his bravado, for she squeezed his hand, as much in support as in her own search for it. He had kissed her before, twice, and felt her respond too. But for some reason it was this touch, offered by her boldly in broad daylight, that felt like a shift of the unseen plates of earth. "I'll make a Maniad out of you yet," he whispered in her ear, and enjoyed the sight of her blush. He could have wagered Granville Hall on the fact her blush was not all anger. When they went in, they were met with a sight now familiar, a gaggle of town worthies standing in the corridor leading to the stately home's drawing-room, eager to see Her Majesty. It was like a familiar court tableau, courtiers, bored to the last wit, waiting for the door to the royal apartments to open, and for their audience to commence, replicated in a provincial miniature. There was a time Hugh took such situations with a dead seriousness he rarely reserved for anything else. It was, after all, the milieu in which his father's life had passed, in which his fortune had been made. Now the sheer pettiness and the ridiculousness of everything all but made him laugh. They didn't have to wait for long. A dark-haired lady-in-waiting stepped through the doorway, no doubt shivering with disgust at the petty surroundings in which she now had to uphold the majesty of the ceremonies, and went pale. Lady Alicia's eyes went to Lavinia. It was clearly only the decades-bred habit of politesse that prevented her from running back into the room, shouting about the errant second keeper's arrival. She was visibly trembling with anticipation as she motioned silently for Lavinia to step into the room before everyone else. Lady Alicia clearly thought Lavinia no longer merited any courtesy, given her incorrect assumption of Lavinia's current status. Hugh wondered if her attitude would change once she was disabused of the notion. The drawing-room of Fauconberg Lodge was a squalid affair even compared to its equivalent in Granville Hall, let alone the throne-room in Windsor or St. James. Had they been admitted to one of these resplendent chambers, cold with marble and dripping with gilding, the pair would have likely been humbled in spirit, as was intended. Here now, however, seeing Queen Charlotte, in her pannier gown and silver-white wig, in the manner of the last decade, with her retinue, holding court from an armchair was comical rather than anything else. It was a magnificent armchair made of gilt-wood, but an armchair nonetheless. "Miss Dudley," she said, her voice icy, her eyes trained like an archer's arrow upon his betrothed, who sank into a deep curtsy. "I have expected you this morning." "I beg your forgiveness, Your Majesty," Lavinia murmured. "I can explain." "I doubt any explanation would be sufficient." No regal wrath here, no accusations of debauchery. She simply berated Lavinia as if she were a lazy housemaid who had forgotten to attend to her duties. And no one was going to berate his Lavinia as if she were a lazy housemaid. Not the Queen of Great Britain, not the Queen of Sheba, not the Queen of Heaven. "Your Majesty," Hugh said, "I am afraid it is me who deserves your anger here. It was my fault that Miss Dudley didn't reach you this morning, for I waylaid her with a singular request." "Have you indeed, Lord Granville?" "I have, Your Majesty. My request was for Miss Dudley to become my wife. I am very happy to say that she has agreed to fulfill it." It was as though he stabbed someone, not proclaimed his intention to marry, judging by the way the room froze around him. Lady Alicia was looking at him with shock. Lady Marianne, standing in the corner, forgot her graceful posture and studied expression of boredom and opened her mouth in the most unladylike manner. Even the Queen raised her eyebrows. "Is this a practical joke, Lord Granville?" "I would have been an even worse man than I used to be, if it were, Your Majesty. I have come to you to ask that you give your consent to our match. I should have requested that before I requested her hand. Since I serve His Majesty and Miss Dudley serves you, it would have been proper." "You serve in rather different capacities, unless my memory betrays me. You are the heir to an ancient title. Miss Dudley was called to serve me out of my daughter's exuberance over her writing. Nothing more." Out of the corner of his eye, Hugh saw Lady Marianne snicker and Lavinia grow pale as though struck. It must have been quite something to hear the years of service she believed to be a thing of high honour and high duty reduced to this. Does it mean, Your Majesty, that you disapprove of the match?
Entirely so. For a viscount to marry a young woman without either a noble title to her name or a penny to her dowry is preposterous. I have no taste for the preposterous.
In that case, Hugh replied, a kind of champagne-like, dangerous cheer rising within him, I will have to resign my post as His Majesty's equerry. In the ensuing silence, one could hear a fly buzzing on the wall.
Do not go beyond the line from where you shall not be able to return, Lord Granville. Your nomination to the post has been my husband's decision, much against my advice on the matter. Should you be so foolish as to surrender this honour, you will never be able to recover it. Neither would your sons, or the sons of their sons, at our heir's court to come.
Hugh had little doubt she would make sure of that. Whatever Queen Charlotte's habits were like, easily forgiving slights was not one of them, and this was exactly how she was likely to see it, as a slight against the benevolence she and her royal husband bestowed upon him. He thought of the hours spent by his own father's side, listening to his wistful tales of the gilded court he was exiled from. It felt like a monstrous injustice back then, almost as though his father was a prince turned out of his kingdom, and Hugh an heir of legend who would restore the Granvilles' rightful throne. But what did this rightful throne at the true king's side amount to in the end? Hours of mindless boredom within four walls. Scores of vicious rumours traded as though they were currency. Layers of breathtaking pretense with their tableaux, their royal chapels, their promenades on the terrace, and their ravings in the night. Lavinia stood by his side, a bright bird with wings broken by servitude in this very gilded court his father had dreamed of until his death. His Lavinia. Hugh drew in a long breath and exhaled slowly. In that case, my sons will have to live without it, much as I am going to love them. I would rather sacrifice their great honours than their very existence.
You made your choice, Lord Granville. I hope, for your sake, you do not come to rue this day, when the attractions of your young bride will fade, Queen Charlotte added. There was something petty about this little cruelty. It was a twist of the knife one could expect from a vicious great-aunt, not something one would hear issued from atop the throne. But then her throne at present was an armchair. How kind of you to worry on my behalf, Your Majesty, but I assure you no such regrets are possible, for the love I bear Miss Dudley has little dependence on the attractions of her youth. The ladies-in-waiting blanched, as though he struck the royal personage instead of politely, outwardly so at least, correcting her. Lavinia did not quite smile. She had a temper too tightly controlled to do so in the presence of the woman who, until 2 minutes ago, had ruled her life, but the corners of her mouth softened almost imperceptibly. It was a small change, the kind Hugh would have never noticed in any of the lovers who enjoyed his company before. The kind of change he imagined a novelist would notice with their eye for human expression and human folly. Perhaps love indeed made artists of everyone. The thought amused him, and when they left the drawing-room, temporarily hallowed by the royal presence with whispers at their back, he smiled. The world around Lavinia seemed transformed. It was like the colours of sunset touching walls, painting them in riotous red. But it was morning, and every sober person would be going about their duties, ignorant about the great change. The only duty left to her was to pack her belongings and prepare for their departure from court. Lavinia didn't bother with the slow, stately walk any more. She raced down the corridors of Fauconberg Lodge as though a giddy girl who never knew fetters. At the landing of the small staircase that led to her room, she even stopped and laughed. She was free! She was finally free! Free and soon to get married to the man she loved most in all the world. Her laughter was cut short when someone gripped her arm, viciously so, their fingers digging in. Lavinia spun around, her giddiness replaced by horror. An absurd thought raced through her head that Perhaps the very walls of the royal court, the walls that went up around it, wherever it went, were going to trap her in, never letting her escape into the green world outside. But the face she saw was not that of some Gothic fury. The face was that of Mrs. Schwellenberg, the first keeper of the robes. "You little schemer," the older woman hissed. "I was right after all. You did find yourself a protector." "In the most noble sense of the word," Lavinia replied, her heart still beating madly from the combination of joy and residual fear. "Not in the one you thought it to be. I suspected you were setting your cap at the Viscount. I should have stopped it at once, back when he made you that strange offer of accompanying him in his carriage. I do wonder what right you would have had to do so, given that you are neither my parent nor my guardian. I am the woman responsible for your performance of your duties here and for your moral conduct. You have neglected the former and disregarded the latter. Do not think that I had not noticed that your bed was undisturbed last night." "You went into my room?" Lavinia stiffened. "I do so every morning." Mrs. Schwellenberg shrugged. "How else am I to know? You have not been getting up to some mischief. In this case, I was right. You have used every trick a young woman can employ to snare a good match, have you not? Let me tell you something I have learnt over decades of serving at this court. A promise does not a marriage make. Your Viscount is not going to marry you now that he's sampled your favours. No man would pay for what he can enjoy for free. When the next spring comes, you are not going to find yourself the mistress of Granville Hall. You are going to find yourself a mistress discarded. Don't call to me begging for me to employ my influence to get your honoured post back." Lavinia almost wanted to laugh again. She used to fear this woman as if she were an agent of divine wrath instead of a vicious harpy whose chief joy was making the lives of those below her station miserable. Well, it occurred to her, no deity could possibly fault her if she were to pay her tormentor in kind at least a little now. "I am not going to crawl to you, Mrs. Schwellenberg. On the contrary, I am going to be an honoured wife of the man I love, and an author of novels that are going to flood the circulating libraries throughout the land. You are going to grow old and expire at this court. You will spend years going through the beds and drawers of young women in search of secrets more exciting than anything in your own life can possibly be." Mrs. Schwellenberg raised her hand to slap her, as though she were a disrespectful, impudent young girl. Lavinia grabbed her wrist. "You will not! Lay your hand on me," Lavinia said, looking into her eyes, full of powerless rage as they were. "You will not even lay a finger on me. You have no power over me now, Mrs. Schwellenberg. I am going beyond this place, and you are not going to follow me there. God forbid I follow you to the gutter, where you are doubtless heading. Then hear the last thing I am ever going to say to you. Pass it to whatever gossip you care. I would rather die in a gutter than live under your eye." Epilogue. "Sir Stephen seemed surprised," Lady Lavinia Granville noted, sitting down on the lavish bed she shared with her husband. "He just thought I was going to wed you much earlier," Hugh replied, running his fingers lightly over the back of her neck, undoing her string of pearls. "I see you are in one of your moods to play a maid to me," Lavinia teased. She couldn't ignore the tingling the anticipation occasioned in her. But why would he have thought so? He saw us in the upper assembly room in Cheltenham. "Our last trip? But oh no, you mean the first time, when we had been engaged in that sordid charade with Miss Peabody." The former Miss Peabody had given the London papers more fodder than they knew what to do with. The Conservative King and Country editors grumbled about the devious foreigners stealing the best English women away, but Lavinia never found out which criteria allowed them to rank Madeline among those best. The newspapers of the more liberal persuasion praised Kurt von Walmoden's petty potentate of a father for proving his generous views by accepting his younger son's marriage below his rank. That was the closest they could have ever come to overtly criticising King George for the old sin of the Royal Marriages Act. When it was first signed, they could, and did,
castigate him for a tyrant. But that was almost 2 decades ago, and in peacetime. Now even the boldest writer for the press had to be cautious. Just then, Hugh's hand moved a little, and the freed necklace slid languidly over Lavinia's skin. She shivered slightly in a way that had little to do with the cold caress of the pearls. He thought he to be my betrothed then, or at least a woman I intended to court.
I remember what you were like back then. Your friend Sir Stephen has a very vivid imagination.
Or perhaps he's just very perceptive, Hugh parried, and noticed the way I was looking at you even back then. Like an artist notices. Or a writer. His arm snaked out around Lavinia's waist, and he pulled her to him. She fell back against him, whimpered out of surprise, laughed and whimpered again, recalling the cost of the gown of white satin with purple breast bows she had been wearing for tonight's ball, and was wearing still.
Be careful, she said breathlessly.
What if I stain or tear it? Ever the careful housekeeper, aren't you? Hugh placed a chaste kiss upon her forehead, then a far less chaste kiss upon her neck, and finally a completely unchaste one upon her mouth. Lavinia responded without a thought, feeling his hands pressing, caressing, undressing. She giggled like a girl when she had to wriggle her arms out of the sleeves, then push the gown down. It didn't take her long to shed her clothing completely. She did not wear the old-fashioned hoops of whalebone to support her petticoats now, the kind that had been de rigueur at court. When Lavinia first tried the simpler new fashions at the mischievous suggestion of her husband during their homebound honeymoon, she felt almost naked with only a shift between her petticoats and her skin. Hugh's very vocal appreciation helped her to get used to it, however, and now she rather delighted in the new freedom of movement. She found it allowed her, among other things, to pace the study created for her in one of the guest bedrooms of Granville Hall very energetically when pondering some twist of her second novel's plot. Art and commerce alike were very far from Lavinia's mind now, however, with Hugh devouring her with his eyes. She blushed a little as she stepped out of the shift, pooling around her feet, and knelt upon the bed. "My Lavinia," Hugh whispered, his hands settling upon her bare hips. "My genius little wife." This is Mary Jane Wells. We hope you have enjoyed this unabridged production of An Authoress and a Viscount, a Regency romance, by Anne Hawthorne. Presented by Anne Hawthorne. Text copyright 2023 by Anne Hawthorne. Production copyright 2023 by Anne Hawthorne. All rights reserved. Thank you for listening.